article today on NFL.com, 10 teams that most need to ace their picks in this year's NFL draft. Here are the 10 teams. Arizona, Carolina, Chicago, Detroit, Green Bay, Houston, Indianapolis, Las Vegas, Minnesota, Washington. 10 teams. 10 teams that most need to ace their picks in this year's draft. What do you, to pull out of those 10 teams, is there any pattern that you notice there?
They all have very high picks.
What I'm pointing to is that all 4 teams in the NFC North are on this list. And I think that what's interesting is that when you say what 10 teams most need to ace their draft, basically to me, it's like the younger teams that are building are the teams that are important to kind of build and to start up. We know the Bears, they're 3-14. They have the number 9 pick. They had the number 1 pick. They traded it back with Carolina. They have 10 draft picks in this upcoming draft. And Ryan Poles is building. He's building up something new here. So obviously for Chicago and the Chicago Bears, they need to ace this draft for Ryan Poles. When you look at Detroit, they were 9-8. They have an opportunity now in front of them to take control of the NFC North. You look at Green Bay, 8-9. The roster is meant to pick up Jordan Love. They don't know what they're going to get out of that quarterback. So everything around Jordan Love has to kind of build around him. And then Minnesota, they're 13-4. Best record of the 10 teams I listed off. They have a new GM, kind of unheard of for a 13-4 team to have a brand new GM, his first draft. And if you look back to last year's draft for the Vikings, they had 10 picks last year and only got 1 starter from the start of the season from the 10 picks that they brought in, thus meaning that 13-4 is a bit flimsy because they don't have the depth that they may have if they were a different team with that type of record around the National Football League. So 4 teams, all in the division, all on the list, 10 teams that have to ace their draft picks in this year's draft. And I think most Bears fans will agree. That's absolutely the position that Ryan Poles is in right now. He needs to ace this draft.
Well, yeah, but the other teams first. So, like, the Lions are almost there, right? Yep. The Lions, people believe that they're going to win the division, that they're almost there. Like, they are a stud defensive player, Jalen Carter, maybe a corner, something like that, away from being that elite football team, right? And so after they won a bunch of games last year, didn't make the playoffs, they're the next team. The Vikings need to prove themselves that they are that 13-4 team that won 13 games last year, but then got rocked in the playoffs. And people were like, see, we told you. Remember, we were doing every week we would look at DVOA drink and we would say, hey, who's the outlier? Oh, the Vikings.
Yeah.
The Vikings are below the halfway point, below bottom half of the league in DVOA. And there's a reason. And when we got to the playoffs, we saw why.
They were the definition of a pretender.
Yeah. The Packers are now, they're not rebuilding, but when you have a new quarterback that's going to be starting for you, you kind of have I believe a little bit of time, but you have to build this foundation up. You have to give him some weapons. You have to add to the defense, maybe the offensive line. You need to add a lot to this team for the Packers. And for the Bears, I mean, we've been talking about it at length for the entire offseason of how important this was. And especially because now you traded back to number 9, it is even more important for Ryan Poles because the Bears now, as much as it pains people to say, they want to be the Lions last year. You want to win a bunch of games, be in the hunt for the playoffs. If you make it, if you don't, not the end of the world, but you want to set yourselves up for the future. So then next year, you're being talked about the way the Lions are being talked about. Hey, if they add that stud defensive lineman, if they add the best defensive player in the draft, because they have Carolina's picks and maybe Carolina is going to be bad next year, watch out for the Bears in 2024. That's why it's so important for Ryan Poles, because you have to build the foundation of this football team. And last year it was easy. You stripped it all down. You added a couple of nice players. You didn't have a first round pick. Like you made it work, right? This year you have a first round pick. It's a top 10 pick. You've got 2 second round picks. Maybe they add more because they want to move up and he doesn't want to sit on his hands for a day and a half. And you need to find a way to turn this and go, as you say all the time, bottom of the pool, back to the top of the pool.
Hit the bottom and jump right back up.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Eric at home, he writes that with 3 or possibly 4 quarterbacks going in the first 8 selections ahead of Chicago, the Bears are likely to have at least one of Poles' 7 blue chip players on the board that he talked about previously. In fact, he might even have 2 or 3 to choose from at the 9th spot.
That's
so
good.
The Bears are in a great spot. They're picking 9th, but because of all the quarterbacks that may go ahead of them, they could end up getting one of the top 5 players in this draft based on overall position. Yep. If you remove the quarterbacks and you hope that teams get desperate and they reach for a Will Levis or an Anthony Richardson.
The more quarterbacks that go in the top 5, the better it is for the Bears. If Arizona finds a way to trade out a 3 and another quarterback goes at 3 and then at 4, that is only better for the Bears because they don't need it back. So take all the quarterbacks you want because that means a better defensive player is going to fall to them, or maybe a better offensive lineman or a corner or whoever you want. Maybe they get the first wide receiver, Jackson Smith and Jigba is there because no one's taken him at that point. The more quarterbacks that he might sit out the year or at least most of the year with a torn ACL, Hendon Hooker, who's to say that he's not going to be taken in the first round?
Sure.
Mike Tenenbaum had a draft yesterday as a GM and put him ahead of Anthony Richardson. And if he was healthy, he'd be ahead of Anthony Richardson. He'd be ahead of Will Levis if he was healthy. But he's not. He's going to miss most of the year with the torn ACL.